All right. Welcome to the Morning Update Show. We'll start with you to kick it off, Melissa. Tell us what this article, and actually, if you can put the article in the comments, Oya, tell us what this article is all about.
Sure. So in a nutshell, we reported for a couple of months on Zoom bombing here, excuse me, I got some of my morning smoothie stuck in my throat. We reported on Zoom bombing that happens in Washington State. So Zoom bombing, it's when people hijack a Zoom recording that's happening where people are meeting, and they'll hijack it by inserting material that's often racist, homophobic, anti-Semitic, or pornographic. And so research has shown that this has become increasingly targeted towards marginalized communities. So we spoke with researchers, civil rights organizations, politicians, also a psychologist, and lawyers, and we found that there's scant recourse for people who are targeted by these incidents. So there's been a call from people who've been targeted by these incidents to have increased education to prevent the attacks, also for there to be greater enforcement and more legal protections for people so that they can actually hold these people accountable who are hijacking.
Oh, wow. Melissa, thank you for that. And, the thing is I've experienced it. Jen, I know that you have personally experienced this as well. What was that like for you? And give us some details on that.
Yeah, so that was sort of how I started looking into this and working with Melissa. It was just a regular day back in February. I work with the Seattle Times Education Lab, and so I was going to meet with some students from the Seattle University Black Student Union to hear about this great scholarship fund that they were putting together to advance Black students who might not otherwise have the means. And, just a few minutes into that meeting, suddenly everything changed on the screen. There were people, like a lot more, about twice as many people who were there who weren't there before. And, some of these attackers are anonymous, but in this case, like some people weren't turning off their cameras and they were shouting the N-word. They were blowing up the chat with just things like N-words must die and things that just, take us all, even though it's happened, as in your last segment mentioned, for years, this kind of language goes around, but this is a new platform that's being utilized in a coordinated way. It's not just one person. There's 15, in some cases, in one case of a documented incident, there were 51 people. Imagine if that happened in a real room. That's what really got me. And it's not just about reporting on these one incidents, but taking a bigger picture look and saying, like, how does this affect us? How does this affect us emotionally? How does this affect us from a cybersecurity standpoint? Who's accountable for that? And so that's where this whole big line of weeks and weeks of asking questions and looking at this issue came about. It was a little personal because I experienced it firsthand, and you feel kind of helpless. And you hear that word, but it stings in a new way.
Yeah. So Melissa, in your reporting, I see that Zoom bombing isn't just resigned to just community groups and students. You also talk about the Kent Chamber of Commerce and even council member Gurmai Zahalai, who's actually been on the Morning Update Show quite a few times.
Right. So I spoke with Zenobia Harris, she's the CEO at the Kent Chamber of Commerce. And so back in July, she was holding an event that was for retailers to try to get them adjusted to COVID-19 to follow protocol. And then shortly after starting the video for this, she had let some people in who, since it's an open forum, anyone is allowed to get in. The link was published online and it was easily accessible to anyone. Some people came in and they hijacked the meeting and they started saying racial slurs against Black people and Asian people. And then they also started playing a video on loop of a Black woman being hung. This was especially traumatizing for Zenobia, who's a Black woman, and she's actually the first Black person to lead the chamber, and it's over a 70-year history. So she was really concerned that maybe this was personally addressed toward her, that maybe they knew that there was a Black CEO and that's why they came in and hacked the meeting in this way. And also it happened shortly after Breonna Taylor was killed by police in Kentucky. So this just made her feel unsafe, and she was concerned about even going into her work after that. So I spoke with her, and she told me it really felt like PTSD for her. And after speaking with a psychologist, Monica Williams at University of Ottawa, she looks at race-based stress and trauma, and she's been looking at online harassment. And she said that this can really push someone over into a PTSD reaction, especially if you're already in a marginalized community or if you've experienced microaggressions or racism in the past. This can affect you in a way even deeper than it would someone who maybe isn't part of a marginalized community and hasn't experienced all of this trauma. So I spoke with them, and then I also talked with Gurmai Zahile, as you mentioned, who's a council member for King County Council, as well as John Taylor, and he's the director of local services. That's like the government arm for the unincorporated King County. So there was a Bryn Mawr Skyway meeting that was held. It was a town hall meeting that was held back in October. And so people were just doing business as usual. And then I think they said about a dozen people came in. They started playing heavy metal music. And then they started just barraging the chat with the N-word. And they put it in the chat box, just repeatedly put the N-word. And so they were able to eject the people from that conference. And then afterwards, John Taylor, he put up a poem, Song of Myself by Walt Whitman, which is a really lengthy poem. He put that in the chat box just to obscure the N-word from view. But yeah, so our research showed that this is just happening across the board to people in government and student unions.
Wow. I mean, what a wide breadth of ways that they're coming in. And Jenn, you spoke earlier about some folks, not being anonymous here. So is there some reporting or something that is really lets us understand who's doing this?
Right. So as with a lot of these things, because they're developing so much in real time, there isn't a ton of research, but I was able to find a few things. So one, there was a study that came out from Boston University and Binghamton University that followed the particular trend that, when the FBI really first caught notice of this trend of Zoom bombing, especially as more people migrated online for work, for school, for worship, back in March 2020. It used to be only a single person. And what this research found is that there's this very intentional practice of a person, and sometimes that person is inside that classroom or inside that meeting group. So they legitimately get access to the link, and then they'll go to a place. They found some evidence on Twitter, a lot of evidence on 4chan of people sharing out the link, sharing the password, and even coaching people and saying things like, my teacher will know if you put this name. So here's the name of someone in my class. So again, this is very intentional. And then they're recruiting people to basically attack or raid a classroom or a meeting space, which definitely raises red flags. The problem with tracking that is that sometimes people can use things like proxy servers, obviously fake names. If you look at incidences are reported, you can Google search it and find articles. You'll hear people using fake names. So it's really hard to kind of track down. But when you are, if people do find your IP address and track you down, then there are different tiers of crimes and charges that could be potentially brought up if that evidence is there. And that's another reason why there's a call from researchers and these community groups have been affected to have more legislation and policy around these issues. So there is more recourse and connection to these, what could be crimes, and definitely from what feels for people who have been targeted, say, you know, there's real pain there. There's real trauma that's created, and it's hacking and you know, not hacking, but, you know, infiltrating a device, a space that's supposed to be for a specific group and not these intrusive outsiders.
Right. Yeah. One of the things we see here is that when it comes to Zoom bombing, that this is difficult to prosecute, and you talk about there's a call for legislation. I know that both of you did some follow-up. We'll start with you first, Jenn. When you talk about the case there at Seattle University and down in Thurston County, and then Melissa, maybe you could chime in as to investigations there at the Seattle Police Department, the King County Sheriff.
Right. So as far as the schools go, we also talked about an incident that happened back in November at Gonzaga University. And they've actually, at Gonzaga, they've been keeping a blog and different updates of their cases. You can find it online. And unfortunately, there's still not much progress in the case. So again, these things take time. So like the 2 Black student union presidents I spoke to, who are seniors, they're graduating this spring. Congratulations to them. But unfortunately, they're going to graduate without any recourse from these incidents, most likely. And in the case of the North Thurston School District, there was follow-up. The school's like internet security director was able to trace an IP address to actually a school in a neighboring district. And so there was some student involvement. But what happens there is that, you know, the North Thurston district doesn't have jurisdiction over the other districts. So basically you have to ask, you know, the other district to discipline a student or a perpetrator. And then when does it become a matter of, you know, especially with a young person, if it's just a disciplinary action, or if it's determined that there's an actual a crime. In some other cases that happened earlier on, back in 2020, when there were more singular incidents, not coordinated incidents, some students have been previously arrested.
And Melissa?
So Zenobia Harris did not report the incident to the Kent Police Department because she wasn't sure if anything would happen from it, and she felt like maybe they had bigger things to be concerned about. I did speak with the Seattle Police Department to see what their policy is on these events, if they track them, and also if there's any department that's looking into this. And they gave me very little information because they said that they had 3 open cases that were possibly Zoom bombing attacks. And they basically just said that they encourage people to contact law enforcement if this happens. And then with the King County Sheriff's Office, so for the Skyway event that happened where people were Zoom bombed during the town hall, there was actually a King County Sheriff's Office representative who was part of the call. They're always part of the town hall events that are put on by the local services department. And so they followed up on the event. They tried to investigate it, but a representative there told me that they weren't able to pursue the case because no person would come forward who was targeted by this, who wanted to see the case through to legal proceedings. And at least from the King County Sheriff's side, they said that that's really the problem in being able to prosecute people, is that they said that it's difficult to find people who will see the legal proceedings through.
Well, you know, you guys also really continued on with the legalities of this. Jenn, I know you were looking at it from a federal level. You spoke to the FBI, correct?
Yeah, I wanted to follow up with the FBI because, again, as I mentioned before, back in March 2020, they did recognize that this was a growing trend, that many people were being affected across state lines. And so they put out some guidance. You know, they were reminding people to password protect their meetings, which actually did kind of create this cascade of holding Zoom and other online platforms more accountable. More people were using Zoom, so they tend to happen there, but no platform is immune. So again, these things happen, but the FBI, when I asked them if they were tracking these incidents, they said they didn't really give me an answer. So I can't say definitively whether they are or they aren't, and if they are tracking this growing trend that the researchers found of specifically coordinated attacks. And again, these coordinated attacks, if you look anecdotally at other news reports of these incidents happening, they tend to be targeting marginalized communities. So whether it's Black student unions, I know during some LGBTQ awareness events, that community was attacked. During International Women's Month in March, there were some women's groups reported being, having their meetings hijacked as well. So there's definite signs that this is, happening. In addition to the research that, again, that there are some insider advantages of sharing this, what should be private meeting information. So even if you do password protect, people are finding, these attackers are finding other ways to infiltrate meetings. So I'm hoping, and I'm wanting to see more guidance and protocols and what's happening, and to see more data. I think that was the one thing we also really struggled to find. But if we look at other issues of security in this country, like being a school reporter, I looked at school shootings, and that was something that wasn't really tracked very well until some grassroots groups really got involved.
Right. And now, Melissa, you followed this up on the state level, and I see that you talked to the Anti-Defamation League. What's some of the information that you were able to get in regards to legalities here in the state of Washington?
Yeah, so the Tech Policy and Advocacy Council, Lauren Kraft from the Anti-Defamation League, she told me from a federal standpoint that there are several laws that could be broken during a Zoom bombing attack, and it all depends on the information that's shared during the Zoom bombing attack, and then also the way that people find out about the event, and then also the events that are being broken into. So, for instance, ones that break a federally protected event, such as court or education, that could be against a federal law. And also, if people are found to be discussing hacking a Bible study, for instance, that could be against a federal civil rights act that protects people's religious beliefs. And so she told me that she's looked through state civil rights laws in Washington and other states, and that some explicitly say that it applies to digital spaces, but that's not the case for Washington. And then I spoke with the Secretary of the Senate, and then also the House Secretary. They gave me a bunch of bills. I looked through them, and I could not find anything that applied to Zoom bombing or hacking video teleconferences. So from speaking with them, and then also Lauren Kraft, there are no known policies throughout Washington that apply to Zoom bombing. The only one that we could find was one that was recently passed in the King County Council on March the 9th, and that related to hacking and the interference of video teleconferences related to recovery meetings and mental health meetings. That was passed by Councilmember Reagan Dunn, who is an outspoken recovering alcoholic, and he's got years of sobriety under his belt. And he just heard from the community that a lot of people were being Zoom bombed during these recovery meetings, and he felt like it was really important when you're recovering to be able to have privacy and anonymity. So that's why he passed that. But there's no criminal, I guess, like repercussions for this. It just says that a person is allowed to file a civil lawsuit against someone for Zoom bombing their event.
Wow.
Damn, like recovery. That's so ill.
Yeah, and that's been such a sacred space for all this time. I mean, honestly, that's why it's, people go there for anonymity.
Yeah. Well, so Melissa, what about you're saying what's not there, and clearly it seems like there's not a lot there. is there any kind of movement that is underway? I mean, it seems like there's so many laws or regulations around cybersecurity, cyber bullying, harassment, and everything else. Is there a category or that this possibly might fit into, or legislation that's being worked on either here locally or nationally?
Yeah, so the Anti-Defamation League does have some model legislation that they've been working on and that they've been trying to propose to different states. So there were a few states that have taken on their model legislation that started in 2019 called Backspace Hate, and it specifically relates to different forms of cyber harassment. And so they were able to convince Washington to pass a law recently that relates to swatting. So it prevents people from calling in and saying that some act is happening at a person's place and then swatting happens there. We know that it happened to Ijeoma Oluo, the author here, after she wrote a book that people swatted her house as I think her young son was there. So it can have deadly results, as we've seen in the past when the cops are called on people.
Yeah, you know what's crazy, and I think Jenn hit on this in the beginning of the interview, was just like, what if it was 51 people who rode up to your spot, you know what I'm saying, or who actually physically came into your meeting? 50 people want to talk. First of all, we already know these guys is real tough on the internet, you know what I'm saying, and real tame in person. And also, this is, you know, if you chase these IP addresses, these hits aren't coming from, like, I'm sure maybe a small percent. They're not coming from the other side of the country. They're not coming from wherever. These are our neighbors, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah.
These are the people that we see at the grocery store. This is the bank teller. This might even be a teacher at a school and some of everything else. And, you know, I don't have the evidence directly to show that, but, you know, we see this increase in hate crimes that are happening locally. We're seeing all these things that are happening locally and everything else. And it kind of, you know, we live with this vision of this super liberal and accepting and yada yada and everything else out here, man. But time and again, we keep seeing it. That's not necessarily the case, Trey.
I mean, really, and there's a couple things here that I think are really spot on. Is that we know we were talking about with the internet in general, it just increased the level that people want to be digital warriors. You know what I'm saying? Pounding on their keyboards or whatever. And now with so many more people doing these video conferencing calls, they have another opportunity to do just that and spew their hate. But we all know, I mean, if it was us holding these meetings in person, we didn't really see a lot of this. It wasn't like they were rolling up and being like, you know, 50 deep, here we come, you know, with our messaging. That wasn't really happening, man. So you're absolutely right. And I think that too, your point is really valid. We saw it with the insurrection. We talk about it all the time, but the fact that so many of those folks were, you know, right here from Seattle, you know what I'm saying? We had law enforcement there, fire department there. At the end of the day, it's not too hard to understand, to follow those trends and think these are our neighbors right in our backyard.
Right. Well, before we let you guys go, Jenn, do you have any guidelines or best practice if someone is Zoom bombed?
Yeah, and I picked on that from the experts and also from people with lived experience. You know, before there's steps you can do before your meeting to you know, protect your password, to make sure that people are registering for your meeting if possible, so that you know, to have a co-host just to kind of like monitor what activity is happening, so you can easily, you know, shut people down if they try to do something out of line. And then, you know, after the meeting, if something does happen, you know, make sure you know the date, the time, the registration IDs for the meeting, a list of your participants, if you can turn that over to authorities. You know, and also it's one of the things I heard, especially from the schools and students that I spoke with, was just how when you go to call for help, when you go to report these, because that's the thing, everyone says, you know, report these incidents. But when the people on the other end aren't either trained or maybe could say the wrong thing during a very sensitive moment, that could really affect how people respond and how they feel, whether they feel protected when an incident like this occurs, because it is very painful, even though it happened online and no one was punching you in the face or anything. But those words hit hard, and so you expect some sympathy or empathy from people, but also that they have training to know how to report it correctly, and how they choose to respond and announce it. And I think the trouble with when this happens to communities that have experienced this onslaught and ongoing hate, that it adds up, and it's not enough for them to say, like, okay, we're going to have a task force meeting, we're going to look at this, we're against it. What other things are you really doing in your community group, in your campus, in your organization, in your government, to protect people against racism and or other forms of oppression, xenophobia, whatever it is. It's really about creating that cultural shift. So how you talk about it before, during, and after also really matters just as much as those actions of investigation.
All right. Man, thank you guys both for taking the time this morning, and a real important article. And we'll put that link in the comments once again for our audience, so they can click on that link and read everything in depth. Jenn Smith, Melissa Hellmann, both from the Seattle Times, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, you guys.
Thank you.
Yes. Bye.
Right.
Wow. I mean,
Man,
they really went in
did
depth.
They reporting hat on?
Yeah. I mean, and the thing about it is that this is a growing trend. This is something that we're seeing. But when we talk about a new avenue, well, no, I'm just saying, when we talk about a new avenue for hate, here we are. These video conferencing calls, they can call them Zoom bombings, but as they said there, that it's not just about Zoom. It's in any of these formats where people are doing these kind of video conference calls. It's man, they went real deep.
Just want to live, man. I mean, when you talk about, it's like, okay, I gotta get a VPN, a proxy server, or this. I mean, it's a lot. You know what I'm saying? People are going through to do all of this, and I mean, this is local.
Yeah. I mean, this is what I'm saying. But we talk about it all the time. I mean, you experience these things, for us, it was these, they coined the term microaggressions, right? Where you would just experience them in public. But again, it wasn't blatant. A lot of people weren't like, what, N-word, they weren't doing necessarily that. But now, those microaggressions are coming out in a digital format.
A lot of people feeling themselves on the internet.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? They feeling themselves on the internet. And I'm telling you, I promise you, a lot of these same people who are here on the internet, Zoom bomb, man, these are our neighbors. These are people that we be around, the people we work with, some of everything else. It's a bigger issue going on that I think a lot of people don't want to realize or recognize of what's happening